Welcome to The Back Cover, the podcast that explores the classic soul music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm Karen Williams. Join me and my co-host Steve Williams, no, we're not related, as we flip over the album covers and share stories of the movers and shakers that created, wrote, and produced those iconic sounds. We'll educate and entertain you, all while keeping the music alive. The Back Cover is recorded from excerpts of our daily radio show, recorded at WLTH-AM in Gary, Indiana. Today we talk with Dr. James Lane, retired professor of history at Indiana University Northwest. Dr. Lane is not only a historian, but a huge fan of VeeJay Records and its owner, Vivian Carter. VeeJay Records was the first successful African-American-owned radio company, before Motown. Its charismatic owner, Vivian Carter, shepherded a company of stars that included the Spaniels of Goodnight Sweetheart fame, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and a little-known English group called the Beatles. Various other artists came and went through the doors of VeeJay as well. Gladys Knight and the Pips, Little Richard, the Staple Singers, and many others. And guess what? Vivian Carter started her record company in her mother's garage in Gary, Indiana. So listen to Dr. Lane and his remembrances of VeeJay Records. This week's podcast is brought to you by SDM Investments, your GPS to financial stability. Visit them at sdminvestments.com.
In 2016, which was the bicentennial of Indiana's statehood, a book came out called Indiana's 200, about the 200 most influential people in Indiana history.
Wow.
And there were three people from Gary in the book. One was Vivian Carter, a second was Michael Jackson, and a third was Bishop Andrew Grutka. I'm glad that the editors recognize the importance of musical history, and in particular the importance of Vivian Carter, the co-founder of VeeJay Records, and of course the King of Pop, Michael Jackson. And I had the honor of writing the article on Vivian. Rock and roll and doo-wop music was a huge part of my life as a teenager, and so I've always been fascinated with the roots of rock and roll. Okay. And I came upon knowing Vivian because of her career first as a DJ. She won a contest that was put on by Al Benson in Chicago.
Yeah.
And the male winner went on to work for Soul Train. But anyway, she worked for WJOB, and then there was a radio station, Gary, WGRY. Right. And from her popularity, she had a show every night called Livin' with Vivian on WCA. And then she also, with Jimmy Bracken, had a record store, 1640 Broadway in Midtown, which was a thriving area at that time. And so teenagers would hang out, and there'd be loudspeakers and
on the outside,
and people would dance. And in those days, you could come in and actually try records. And Gary Roosevelt grads who formed ultimately the Spaniels, and they sang a couple songs for her, and so she and Jimmy Bracken started this label with Jimmy Reed and the Spaniels, and it became almost an instant success, with especially Goodnight Sweetheart being a real breakthrough for the Spaniels. Baby It's You, I think, was their first song that also made the R&B Billboard Top 10.
I'm with you so far. Can I add something to that?
Go ahead.
You probably know. Vivian and Jimmy had a silent partner as well. His name was Ewart Abner.
Oh, I've heard about Ewart. He had a Great Dane, and
I met Ewart back in 1989 in Atlanta. Had no idea who he was until I did some research on him after I met him, and because when VeeJay sort of went under. He went to work for Motown.
Yeah.
But yeah, they few people talk about Ewart, but Ewart actually knew the record business where Vivian and Jimmy really didn't. But they also had a silent partner with Vivian's brother,
Calvin.
He was a real A&R man.
Yeah, he would find musical talent, and Jimmy was street smart. And you know, after World War II, you'd have the clubs in Chicago and in Gary too.
Yeah.
And electric blues, they called it, that was played at those clubs. And he and Calvin, I think, found a lot of the people that that initially came over.
Oh yeah.
Jimmy Reed was in somebody else's band and wanted to go solo. That's what happened. Gene Chandler, I think,
with the Duquesnes
wanted to be.
The Duquesnes.
Yeah, that was the name of the group, the Duquesnes.
And Duke of Earl, if you listen to it, it's a nonsense song, really. What does it mean? But
if you saw it on paper,
but it's unforgettable, right?
Oh man.
There's a rumor that the money that they borrowed to start the label came from one of the policy bosses in Gary.
I believe that. Policy was huge.
They started actually with the record store, and the building that they purchased in Chicago is still up, because with the bankruptcy and everything, Brunswick Records moved in and bought it after that. But it's still up. It's still there, and it's boarded up. Right down the street from Chess. But Ewart, as he told me, he could have saved the company, but back then people weren't doing incorporated, or they didn't know to incorporate, or what we call LLC now. So when the ship sank, they went down with it. Everything went down.
So what happened that really shut down VeeJay? You said the internal revenue, but I saw the story where they said if she could have paid, I don't know, what was it that shut them down, really?
Well, they lived well. Vivian, she had a Cadillac convertible, and
she loved it,
and a mink coat, and she loved the notoriety. Her story is rags to riches to rags, and she started out in her mother's basement, and it kind of ended up there too, basically. I think it was changing musical tastes, competition. The you might call the big boys, the RCA and Capitol
they started
labels.
Taking notice.
They had this contract. They made it with a British company. They wanted to sign this guy Frankie Ifield, who was kind of like a Tom Jones singer, and the Beatles were kind of a throw-in. They kind of fell into their lap.
Take him, and y'all can have him.
But then once the Beatles were popular, there were suits. The Beatles tried to get out of their contract, and so now they're dealing with RCA and Capitol and these giants, and the you might call VeeJay a small independent label.
Small.
It was hard for them to compete with the big boys who had
money,
who had 20 lawyers for everyone that might have been working for VeeJay.
Yeah.
So there were those kind of suits where they couldn't hang on to. Now Pop Staples was a very shrewd businessman, and he signed contract just record to record, and I think they put out about 6 albums. But it was the same with like John Lee Hooker. He put out 5 or 6 albums with VeeJay. But then when they get popular and the big companies
with the money
wanted to hire them, there were a lot of groups that moved from label to label. Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded a couple songs with VeeJay. You can go on and on.
Oh man!
Is Vivian probably the first woman in America to have a record company as successful?
Exactly. Yeah, and it was.
So she's the first woman, the first black woman to have a record.
The label was the first black label that was successful. Now, I would think the first woman executive. I'm not totally positive about that. Yeah.
Okay.
But they first recorded in their mother's garage
down the street,
and they
in the
had,
record store.
And at first they had I think it was Chance Record distributing there.
Right.
They didn't have a distribution, but Chance went under, and so in time they did that themselves. They, like you say, they moved to Chicago and eventually to Record Row near Chess Records and Brunswick and several others, and they opened an L.A. office, and they signed up some groups that weren't quite as successful.
That would be Ewart.
That was his grandiose idea, and throwing. And back then you had to wine and dine the record DJs and their companies, and he'd rent a penthouse suite in Vegas, and rumor was he liked to gamble a little bit.
Oh man!
But
Moulin Rouge.
But also, and you referred to this. The number one, the Internal Revenue Service was rapacious when it came to black owners. What they did to Joe Louis is criminal, and they went after successful black entrepreneurs. There's no question about that, and maybe if they had accountants that knew how to set up
the loopholes,
ways to cover the expenses more. I think they could have survived. They also, ironically, the year of their greatest success was not only when they signed the Four Seasons, but also the Beatles.
Beatles.
But the managers of those companies, of the Beatles and the Four Seasons, they wanted their money, every single penny.
Right.
And then after that, with the British invasion, not only did a lot of the black groups not get onto the charts anymore, but with the success of VeeJay, you had other labels promoting black groups.
Right.
They weren't the only ones, and so it was a combination of things that. But their success was quite amazing, and they not only put out doo-wop and rock and roll, but
gospel.
Vivian had signed some of the best gospel groups.
Oh.
They had the Staple Sisters, of course. Uncloudy Day. That's the best.
That's the best
song you've ever heard, and Mavis is still around.
Still.
And then a whole line of jazz albums. So
let's go down the line with the gospel, Doc. Let me come out with a few staple singers. Highway QCs from Chicago.
Sam Cooke and Lou Rawls.
Right. The Pilgrim Jubilees. Johnny Taylor did gospel on VeeJay, as well as doo-wop with the Five Echoes from Here.
Okay.
Song named Tasty Freeze. Help me out here, Doc. Ramsey Lewis, For a Moment, with Maurice White.
Okay.
One of her biggest problems, if I may, was right down the street from her. Chess. The Dells left VeeJay and went straight down the street to Chess.
Sure.
Vivian didn't really like the sound of the Dells for some reason, but Jimmy did. But as Chuck told me, they just couldn't get along. She couldn't get along with a lot of the artists, but Jimmy is the man that held all the glue together. But didn't you think that was kind of rare for a record company owner to get involved with that? But she loved Jerry Butler. Couldn't stand Curtis Mayfield. If you could do it all over again, what would you change?
About not a thing about the music I listen to, but I wish I came to Gary in 1970. I just wish I had met her. She had a late night gospel. Her first love was gospel. And she had a late night. She evidently had a late night gospel show on WWCA.
She
after
did. My grandmother listened to it.
Okay, and so I can imagine her late at night just grooving on the music she was playing and getting spirituality from it.
Al Benson loved her. Al Benson made careers for a lot of people because he bartered all of his time. He had 6 hours maybe, but he bartered. There wasn't a black radio station per se. They bartered time, but VON has the proud thing about being the first black programmed radio station in the area, April 1st, 1963. And Al Benson, the old swing master, he, like you said, Vivian won that contest, and Don Cornelius won another contest. But there was a guy that Al Benson groomed, and no one ever talks about him because I really don't think they know him. But he had one of the biggest radio conventions ever, and his name was Jack Gibson. They called him Jockey Jack. And he worked for Al Benson as what we call in radio back in the day a gopher. Get the coffee, things of that nature for the jock. He moved to Atlanta and got on the first black-owned radio station, WERD, Jack Gibson. And for years, if you were anybody in radio or records, you showed up at the Jack the Rapper's convention in Atlanta. Remember me telling you about that? That's where I met Ewart Abner, Ed Cook, E. Rodney Jones, Bernadine C. Washington, all these people. Vivian could have very well been there, but I wouldn't. And I met the guy, John, WLAC Nashville, John House, the House Man. So, man,
and people, Elvis listened to black music
all the time.
That's where he got his inspiration and uniqueness.
Right.
I mean, I did too. I listened to a black station in Philadelphia, and I remember the first time I ever heard a Sunday morning service on that black station with drums, and I said, this is fun.
That's the end of this week's podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next week.